Tonight, we aren't doing the show the network paid for. These 8 words nearly ended The Tonight Show forever after Johnny Carson discovered a red X on his script, a corporate command to silence a heartbreaking secret he had promised to protect. They weren't the usual stagehands or the familiar faces of the production crew who shared jokes and coffee in the hallways. These were high-level executives from the New York office, the ones who measured success in decimal points and advertising revenue rather than smiles. Johnny caught the eye of his longtime producer and dear friend, Fred de Cordova, and saw a look of genuine, unfiltered fear that he had never witnessed in all their years together. Fred whispered that the writer's room had been bypassed and the standard monologue scrapped by the network's legal department. Johnny walked toward his desk during the final moments of the commercial break, his heart heavy with a growing sense of dread, feeling that red letter X acting as a silent, aggressive command, a barrier between a man and his conscience, placed there by people who thought they could own his voice and his very soul. The audience began to clap in that rhythmic, thunderous applause that had fueled Johnny's soul for years. Yet, as he looked out at the sea of faces, he felt a profound, aching disconnect. They were there for the man they trusted, a nightly guest in their living rooms and a friend who never lied to them. He glanced at the teleprompter, but the words scrolling upward were foreign and icy. They were corporate mandates designed to protect a wealthy sponsor, a cold, plastic television manufacturer, at the expense of a human being's dignity. Johnny's hands began to tremble as he realized the magnitude of the betrayal. He looked toward the wings where Ed McMahon stood, but Ed's face was pale, his eyes darting toward the executive booth where the men in suits watched like vultures. The red light flickered to life, the signal that 20 million Americans were now peering into his soul. As the theme music reached its crescendo, Johnny didn't offer his trademark grin or the playful golf swing that had defined a generation. He stood perfectly still, a lone figure of defiance, feeling the weight of a secret he had promised to protect. The Carson cool that had carried him through thousands of hours of live television was shattering into 1,000 pieces under the glare. He knew that the next 30 seconds would either cement his legacy as a man of honor or mark the moment he finally sold his soul to the highest bidder in the corporate hierarchy. If you want to see more of these hidden, emotional chapters from the lives of Hollywood's greatest icons, please hit that subscribe button and join our community of storytellers. Johnny never cared about the money or the glittering trophies. He cared about the unspoken bond of truth he shared with the millions of people who invited him into their spaces every night. To the executives, The Tonight Show was merely a vehicle for 30-second commercials, but to Johnny, it was a sacred trust. As the red light stayed fixed on him, he looked at the scrolling text and felt a wave of nausea. The network had replaced his planned interview with a local hero, a woman who had spent 40 years teaching children to read, with a pre-packaged segment designed to flatter a conglomerate selling cold, soulless machinery. It was a calculated betrayal of everything the show stood for, an attempt to turn human connection into a transactional billboard for the sake of profit. The script they wanted him to read was filled with forced enthusiasm that felt like ash in his mouth. It demanded that he ignore the elderly woman sitting just 20 feet away in the shadows of the wings, a woman he had personally invited after reading about her struggle to keep her small-town library afloat. The executives had deemed her story unremarkable, choosing instead to push a shiny new product with no soul and no history. Johnny looked into the lens, and for a split second, the audience might have thought there was a technical glitch, but the truth was far more dramatic. He was looking straight into the eyes of the men in the booth who believed they could buy his integrity. He thought of the thousands of letters he received from people who lived quiet, difficult lives, people who looked to him for a glimmer of hope, not a sales pitch. In that moment of heavy silence, Johnny realized the network was asking him to turn his back on the very people who had made him a legend. He felt the phantom weight of the red X on his desk, a mark of censorship that burned like a brand. He knew that if he followed those scrolling words, he would never be able to look at himself in the mirror again without seeing a total stranger. The tension in the studio was thick, a palpable vibration that made camera operators look at each other with wide, uncertain eyes. Even Ed McMahon seemed to hold his breath, sensing that the king of late night was standing on a precipice. The corporate mandate was a wall, but Johnny had always been a man who knew how to find the cracks in the stone. He knew that choosing to fight back would mean risking the throne he had built over decades of hard work. But as he looked toward the darkness of the stage entrance, he saw the silhouette of a woman who had traveled 500 miles just to share a message of love, and his decision was made. While executives upstairs were calculating their projected profits, a 70-year-old retired schoolteacher named Martha sat in dressing room 10, unaware she had become the center of a corporate storm. She was a woman whose hands were mapped with the lines of 1,000 stories, clutching a faded photograph of a small brick building that had been her life's work. To the men in suits, she was an invisible statistic, but to Johnny, she was the heartbeat of America. He had found her letter buried in a stack, a simple plea for a chance to say goodbye to the library that had been the soul of her community before the bank moved in to tear it down. Martha had arrived in her best Sunday dress, a floral print pressed with the kind of care only a woman of her generation understood. She had spent 40 years placing books into the small, eager hands of children, teaching them that their dreams were larger than the dusty streets of their mining town. When the library's roof had begun to fail and the local council had turned their backs, Martha had used her own modest pension to keep the doors open until there was nothing left. Johnny had been so moved by her quiet loss of livelihood that he had promised her a seat on that famous multicolored couch, a platform where her voice would finally be heard by the world. He wanted her to know that her life had mattered, that the quiet work of a teacher was more valuable than all the gold in California. Now, as studio lights hummed with a tension that Martha couldn't name, she sat backstage and smoothed the photograph once more. She didn't know about the red letter X or the scrolling corporate lines. She only knew that the man she had watched every night for 20 years had reached out his hand to her. In her mind, she was just a guest of a friend, waiting for her turn to tell the world about children who had learned to fly through the pages of a book. She had no idea the network had already tried to erase her name from the guest list, treating her like a mistake to be corrected. But Johnny had a long memory, and he remembered how his own mother had valued the truth above all else. He looked at the monitor, showing the hallway leading to Martha's room, and felt a surge of protective fire. The stage was set for a confrontation that went far beyond ratings, as the seconds ticked down toward a moment that would change Martha's life forever. The stage manager's voice cracked when he gave the count. 30 seconds, Mr. Carson. The air in the studio had become so heavy, it felt as though the very oxygen had been replaced by a suffocating, static electricity. In the shadows, Ed McMahon leaned against his podium, his usual jovial mask replaced by profound concern as he watched his friend stare down the lens of the primary camera. Ed knew that look. It was the expression of a man who had reached a point of no return, a man about to choose a path that could lead to his own professional end of days. Up in the glass-walled booth, the executives sat like judges in a high-stakes trial. One of them barked a final reminder into the director's ear to ensure the teleprompter was moving at the exact speed of the corporate script. They were confident that the lure of the spotlight and a multi-million-dollar contract would keep Johnny in line, believing no man would throw it all away for a retired schoolteacher from a town they didn't care to name. The countdown continued, 2 fingers, then 1, as the iconic notes of the orchestra swelled to a deafening volume, filling the room with a celebratory sound that felt entirely at odds with the battle being waged. Johnny stood behind his desk, his eyes darting once more to the red letter X that sat there like a stain. He could feel the eyes of 20 million people at home, those loyal viewers who had aged alongside him, who had shared their evenings with him through 3 different presidencies and countless national heartbreaks. He knew that if he spoke the words the network had written, he would be lying to every one of them. He thought of Martha, holding a photograph of a library being dismantled by a world of cold metal and plastic. He realized that this wasn't just about a guest list. It was about whether a man's words still meant something in a world built on hollow promises and high-frequency static. The floor director pointed his finger, signaling that the microphone was live. The audience's applause reached a fever pitch, but tonight, Johnny remained frozen, a statue of moral conviction. The first line of the mandated script appeared on the screen, waiting for him to breathe life into its artificial sentiments. But as Johnny took a deep breath, his hand reached out not for the script, but for the edge of the teleprompter screen itself. Every heart in the studio seemed to stop at once as the king of late night prepared to do the unthinkable. The world was watching, the executives were waiting, and the man who never missed a beat was about to skip the most important one of his life. Would you like me to continue with Section 5, where Johnny begins his rebellion? CTA 2. This would be the perfect moment to ask your viewers, If you were in Johnny's shoes, would you risk your career for a promise? Let us know in the comments below. The theme music faded into a silence so profound it felt as though the walls were holding their breath. When the camera finally landed on Johnny, he didn't look at the glowing text. Instead, he reached out with a slow, deliberate motion and physically pushed the teleprompter screen away from his line of vision. The metal stand let out a faint, metallic groan that echoed through the rafters, like a shot from a starter's pistol, the sound of a bridge burning in the heart of Burbank. The executives in the booth jumped to their feet as they realized the king of late night was no longer following the rules of their kingdom. Johnny leaned forward, his eyes searching the lens for the millions of friends sitting in their living rooms. He didn't offer the usual witty banter. His face was a mask of weary, honest determination. "Tonight," he told the audience, his voice dropping into that intimate register, "we aren't doing the show that the National Broadcasting Company paid for." He explained that there were moments when the script he was handed felt like a heavy stone. He looked directly at the red letter X on his desk and then back at the camera, admitting that he had been told to remain silent about a story that had broken his heart, but he had decided that his silence was not for sale. A collective gasp rippled through the audience, a sound of shock that gave way to tentative applause. Johnny continued, his words flowing with a raw passion that no writer could have manufactured in 1,000 years. He spoke about the importance of quiet lives, and how easily they were forgotten by those who only saw the world through a balance sheet. He was risking a 20-year career. But as he spoke, the trembling in his hands stopped and was replaced by a steady strength. He was no longer a performer. He was a man reclaiming his dignity in front of the entire world. The tension in the control room reached a breaking point, with fingers hovering over the switches that could cut the broadcast. But Johnny didn't blink. He had crossed the line, and now there was only one thing left to do. He had to bring the truth into the light. He turned his head toward the dark curtain where a 70-year-old woman was waiting. The world was about to meet Martha, and nothing the men in the charcoal suits could do would stop the emotional tidal wave about to break over the stage. "Martha, come on out here," Johnny said, his voice shedding its polished sheen to become the gentle tone of a man welcoming a guest into his home. He stood up from his chair, a gesture of profound respect, and kept his back turned to the frantic gestures in the wings. As Martha stepped out, her small frame appeared, swallowed by the vastness of the stage. But the way Johnny walked toward her made the studio feel as intimate as a kitchen table. He took her hand, noting the roughness of skin that had spent 40 years turning pages, and guided her toward the couch with a tenderness that brought a lump to the throats of everyone watching. The audience, who had been expecting a high-energy interview, fell into a hush so deep you could hear the hum of the stage lights. Martha sat down, clutching her photograph like a shield, her eyes wide as she looked at the sea of faces. Johnny didn't return to his desk. Instead, he sat on the edge of his seat, ignoring the "wrap it up" cues flashing aggressively from the back of the room, where executives watched with white-knuckled intensity. He asked her to tell the story of the day she realized the library would have to close, and as she spoke, the artificial glamour dissolved into something beautiful and real. She talked about children who found safety between the rows of books, and how she had spent her final paycheck just to keep the heat on for one last winter. Every word she spoke was a testament to a life lived for others, a quiet heroism the executives had labeled unremarkable. Johnny watched her with pure admiration, his own eyes glistening as he realized he was looking at the very best of the human spirit. He reached out and touched the photograph, treating her memories with the kind of reverence usually reserved for sacred texts. For those few minutes, the ratings didn't matter, the sponsors were forgotten, and the looming threat of a canceled contract felt like a distant noise. Johnny was giving this woman back her voice in front of millions of people who were suddenly realizing that their own lives were mirrored in her struggle. As Martha finished her sentence, a single tear escaped, a silent punctuation mark to a story of living a life of service. Johnny reached into his pocket and handed her his own silk handkerchief, a small act of kindness that felt like a monumental shift in history. The silence that followed was a shared heartbeat between a legend and a school teacher. But behind the scenes, the corporate machinery was beginning to grind into gear, preparing to punish the man who had dared to break the silence. CTA 3. If this moment of courage touched your heart, please share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that one voice can still change everything. Up in the glass booth, The men in charcoal suits were witnessing a mutiny. One executive began screaming into his headset, his voice a jagged edge of panic. "Cutting the feed," he barked, demanding the screen be plunged into darkness or filled with a pre-recorded commercial. They wanted to silence the truth before it could take root in the hearts of millions watching at home, terrified that one woman's story would cost them the favor of sponsors who wanted only to sell their plastic television boxes. But something miraculous was happening in the trenches. The technical director, Bill, who had worked by Johnny's side for 15 years, sat with his hand hovering over the master switch, but he didn't move a muscle to comply. He looked through the glass at Johnny and Martha, two figures bathed in a soft glow, and he felt a lump in his throat. Around him, other operators exchanged silent looks of solidarity, their eyes wet, with the same tears falling in living rooms across the country. They knew that if they pulled the plug now, they would be ruining a moment of pure humanity that might never happen again. The executive reached over Bill's shoulder, but Bill leaned back, physically blocking the console in a move that would surely cost him his livelihood by morning. "You can fire me," Bill whispered, "but you're not stopping this." The booth became a microcosm of the struggle between profit and the warm heart of the human spirit. Below them on stage, the cameramen began to move with a grace that felt almost spiritual, tightening the shots on Martha's weathered face, ensuring that every flicker of emotion was captured. They were no longer employees of a network. They were the guardians of a story that belonged to the people, and for the first time, the wrap it up signs were ignored. The executives realized they had lost control, and the panic in the booth was replaced by a heavy silence as they watched the ratings numbers do something they had never seen before. Instead of people turning away, the audience was growing by the second, as word spread that the king of late night was finally telling the truth. Johnny sensed the chaos in the booth without ever having to look up, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He knew the axe was falling behind the scenes, but he also knew that for the next few minutes, the stage belonged entirely to the lady from the library. For 90 seconds, the busiest studio in Hollywood fell into a silence so profound that the only sound was the ticking of the clock and the soft breathing of a woman who had spent her life in service. Martha spoke of the final day, the day the movers came to take the oak tables where generations of children had learned to dream. She didn't speak with bitterness, but with a fading hope that someone might remember that a book was a doorway to a better life. Johnny sat perfectly still, his legendary wit tucked away, as he watched a 70-year-old woman lay her heart bare before a nation, while executives sat paralyzed by their own looming defeat. The audience didn't clap, they simply wept, a collective outpouring of emotion that reached into every corner of the country. People sitting in Ohio and Florida felt a sudden connection to this stranger, realizing their own local landmarks were just as precious. Johnny took off his glasses and wiped his eyes, a rare moment of public vulnerability from a man who had spent 30 years being the most composed person in the room. He realized that this silence was the most meaningful television he had ever produced, a moment of unscripted reality that no corporate sponsor could replicate. The cameras stayed tight on Martha's face, capturing the way her eyes lit up when she mentioned a young boy who had finally mastered his alphabet under her guidance. In that moment of shared grief, the artifice of celebrity vanished entirely, leaving behind only two human beings talking about what it means to care for a community. Johnny reached out and squeezed Martha's hand, a silent promise that her story would not pass away in the darkness of an executive's filing cabinet. He looked at the camera one more time, and his expression was no longer one of defiance, but of deep peace. The corporate world was still screaming in the shadows, but in the center of the spotlight, there was only the truth, and it was more powerful than anything the network could throw against it. The weight of the moment felt like a physical presence in the room, a shared breath that connected the star and the teacher. But even as the emotional peak was reached, the shadows in the wings were growing longer, and the reckoning that awaited Johnny after the cameras went dark was drawing closer with every beat of his heart. When the cameras finally went black, the silence that followed felt like a physical weight on the shoulders of everyone present. Johnny didn't move immediately. He stayed beside Martha, keeping his hand over hers until the last echo of the theme music had vanished. In the hallway just outside the stage door, the air was thick with corporate fury as three executives stood waiting like a firing squad. They had watched their authority be dismantled in front of 20 million people, and they were prepared to make the king of late night pay the price for his moment of humanity. As Johnny walked toward the exit, he was met by the head of the network, whose face was a stony mask of indignation. "You're finished, Carson," the executive hissed, pointing a trembling finger at the man who had been the face of their company for decades. He told Johnny that he had violated every clause in his contract and that he would never step foot on that stage again. Johnny didn't flinch. He simply stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking at the man with a mixture of pity and clarity. He waited until the executive had finished his tirade. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out the small, red letter X he had peeled off his desk earlier that evening. "I'm not the one who's finished," Johnny said, his voice calm and steady. "But if you want my chair, you can have it." He explained that a man who couldn't recognize the value of a woman like Martha didn't deserve a voice in the living rooms of America. He gave the executive a chilling ultimatum: allow him to finish what he had started and help Martha save her library, or find someone else to tell jokes to an empty room tomorrow. The executives looked at each other, their bravado faltering as they realized the public outcry from ending the professional life of the most beloved man in the country would be a catastrophe they could not survive. Johnny walked past them without waiting for an answer, heading toward his dressing room to find the woman he had risked everything to protect. The power dynamic in the building had shifted in a single hour, moving back into the hands of a man who remembered what it meant to be human. He knew the battle was far from over, but as he closed his door, he saw a light in Martha's eyes that made every corporate mandate feel completely hollow. Decades later, a janitor clearing out a small, forgotten home in Ohio discovered something that shouldn't have existed: a small wooden box containing a secret that would rewrite the history of The Tonight Show. Inside was a single sheet of embossed stationery that held the secret of a life transformed. It was a note written in the unmistakable, elegant hand of Johnny Carson, dated the morning after that legendary night of defiance. The ink had faded slightly over the decades, but the message remained as vibrant as the moment it was penned, a testament to the fact that some scripts are written by the heart rather than a team of writers in a back room. The world had moved on, and the corporate battle had become nothing more than a whisper in the archives. But for Martha and her town, the story had only just begun. The day after the broadcast, a fleet of trucks had arrived at the site of the old library, not to carry away shelves, but to deliver thousands of new books, many accompanied by small notes from strangers moved to tears by a 70-year-old woman's dignity. Johnny hadn't just used his voice. He had used his own private wealth to set up a permanent trust, ensuring the library would never have to worry about a failing roof or a cold furnace again. He had done it all anonymously, hiding behind a charitable foundation so the focus would remain on the children and the books, rather than the celebrity who made it happen. Martha had spent the remaining years of her life in that library, sitting in a new oak chair that Johnny had personally picked out, watching as a new generation of children discovered the magic of the written word. Whenever a child would ask her how a little library in a forgotten town had managed to stay open when so many others were fading away, she would simply smile and point to a small, gold-framed photograph on the wall. It was a candid shot of a man in a gray suit, sitting on a multicolored couch, leaning in close to listen to a woman in a floral dress. She never told them about the red letter X or the screaming executives, because she knew the true legacy of that night wasn't the conflict, but the connection forged in the silence between the jokes. The lesson Johnny Carson left behind wasn't found in the ratings or the massive studio contracts, but in the quiet realization that our lives are defined by the moments when we refuse to follow the script of the world and choose to follow the script of our conscience. He proved that even in a world obsessed with the next big thing, the most enduring thing we can offer one another is the simple gift of being seen and heard. As the sun sets on the legends of the past, we are left with the warming glow of a story that reminds us that no act of kindness is ever truly lost. Johnny Carson might have been the king of late night, but in the heart of a small-town teacher, he was simply the man who made sure the stories never had to end. Every time a page is turned, every time a child's eyes light up at a new discovery in a quiet corner of a library, Johnny's defiant act lives on. It is a reminder that the truth is always worth the risk, and that the man behind the desk was even greater than the legend we saw on screen. It was a night when television stopped being a business and finally became a home for the human soul, an eternal testament to the fact that a single, unscripted moment can ripple through time and change the world forever. The red X was gone, the suits were silent, and in the end, the library doors stayed open, just as Johnny had promised. If Johnny's courage reminded you that one person truly can make a difference, please give this video a chance to help us share his legacy with more people. Every story we tell is a journey into the heart of the legends you love, so don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell to join us for our next chapter. Thank you for watching, and remember, your voice matters just as much as those on the stage.